Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
Always glad to have with us on a Tuesday Alfred University history professor, Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, thank you for calling in.
Well, my pleasure.
Dr. Ostrower, touching on the fire briefly, you were mayor of Alfred and were involved in Alfred politics for many years. Were there ever any incidents like this in Alfred? 8 houses affected.
Well, we certainly had our share of fires, individual fires here and there. And when I say our share, actually not very many at all. What happened in Hornell, this week is really a catastrophe. I certainly want to extend my own sympathy to the homeowners, who have lost their places of residence right now. And I do want to repeat something that you mentioned a moment ago during the news, namely that if people do want to contribute, they can do so through Maple City Savings and Loan, and I believe that the local number is 324-1822, and not simply contributing in respect to a check. They can send gift cards. There are any number of different ways in which people can contribute to the to help those who have lost, in some cases, virtually all of their belongings. But we didn't have this kind of a catastrophe, as I say, in Alfred, not during the 24 years that I was on the village board, 6 of them when I was serving as mayor.
Yes, quite the horrible incident there on Sunday, and miraculous that none of the people were injured or killed, considering the number of houses that were affected. Well, moving on to Washington, D.C. politics, Dr. Ostrower, there's quite a bit going on there. The impeachment proceedings will continue today. Your thoughts on what we've seen so far, Dr. Gary Ostrower?
Well, I guess the most striking thing from my perspective is the professionalism of the people who have testified, many of those who have testified openly so far. These are not partisans. People like William Taylor, Mr. Taylor, Ambassador Taylor, was appointed, I might add, to his post as the inter-ambassador of Ukraine by the Trump administration. These are people, President Trump has tried to diminish the importance of what they have said, tried to demean them individually by suggesting that those who are testifying are never Trumpers, or those who are testifying are partisans. That's not the case. I mean, these are very, very professional people. Marie Yovanovitch, who testified last week, I think it was on Friday, was an extremely, how shall I put it, a credible witness, a believable witness. She doesn't have an axe to grind, other than the fact that she was not only smeared by Giuliani and by the president himself, but implied at least a kind of threat that has been made against her. We should not be witnessing this kind of thing in the United States of America, and I think it says a lot about the character of the president. It says a lot about the character of the administration, that we're seeing some very, very highly credible, some very, very highly respectable public servants, people who have given their lives to this country. In Marie Yovanovitch's case, she served for over 30 years. Today, I believe, this morning, we're going to hear from Lieutenant Colonel Vindeman, and he was likewise, he's been smeared by the administration. He was on the National Security Council. That's not exactly that's very close to the president. It's an office within the White House. He was on that phone call that the president had made to the president, our president had made to the president of the Ukraine. He's a decorated Army officer. He received the Purple Heart from his service in Iraq. These are people who are in every way, I think, we should view them as heroes rather than as people who, to one extent or another, are partisan. administration. But our president, because I think he has a very weak ego, because he is unable to accept criticism, because he is so fearful, I think, about the degree to which he's undermining his own presidency, he attacks. He simply cannot accept criticism. He can't say, hey, maybe I did something that was wrong. And when I say something that was wrong, in this case, something that is clearly illegal, because what he did was to try to extort Ukraine, to extort them in the sense of withholding $400 million worth of military equipment, which they needed, almost $400 million, unless they dug up dirt on Trump's political opponents. And ladies and gentlemen, that is illegal. That is an impeachable act. And I want to say one more thing, if I may, about the way in which the president has responded to this. He's talked about the phony impeachment clause. He's talked about the phony emoluments clause, and he's referring here to clauses in the United States Constitution. And he tells us, go back and read the transcript of that telephone call between himself and the Ukrainian president. Well, I've read that transcript. It's not really a transcript, okay? It's a kind of a compilation of what people remember from that call. But even if we call it a transcript, it is very, very damning. And I find it kind of odd that, the people who are wearing T-shirts in support of the president saying, read the transcript, because the president says there was nothing wrong in that transcript. Go back and read it, because it clearly shows that the president is trying to hold up the government of Ukraine to serve his own political purposes. That is an impeachable act, and the Constitution is crystal clear about that. The emoluments clause that the president diminishes, that he criticizes, calls it the phony emoluments clause. It's found in the Constitution. There's nothing phony about this. What I think you have, in other words, is a president who's trying to obscure the truth and trying to, in many ways, just squiggle out of the fact that he has indeed, that he has committed impeachable offenses. We've never seen anything like this. We've certainly had impeachments before. We've had it with President Clinton. We had it with President Johnson back in the 19th century, and of course with President Nixon. But the offense, the kind of the offense that this president has launched against our Constitution, I think, is very, very upsetting, and I think it should worry all of us.
Dr. Ostrower, also you mentioned how Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman is going to be speaking today. I've got the list from New York Mag of who's going to be speaking today. And the hearing is coming up in about 20 minutes. Another person who will be speaking, and this will be in the morning, Vindman goes first, then Jennifer Williams, special advisor to Vice President Pence on Europe and Russia. In the afternoon session, it's going to be Kurt Volker, the former Ukrainian special envoy, and Tim Morrison, former White House national security aide. Do you have any sense of what will come out of the testimony of those witnesses?
Well, I think that with Jennifer Williams, who is an aide, as you mentioned a moment ago, to the vice president, she is essentially going to say that what I heard on that phone call was very, very unusual and very upsetting. In other words, I think she's essentially going to reaffirm the point that people like Taylor and Yovanovitch have already said. So, I mean, this is part of the case in a sense against the president. Coming from people within the administration itself. Jennifer Williams was a State Department employee. She's an expert on Russia and on Ukraine. She was assigned to Vice President Pence's office. And I think that it raises another issue, which is, what does the Vice President know about this? What was he told about this? At what point was he told about this? The Vice President has kept a very, very low profile in all of this, in part because perhaps, he's contemplating the fact that he may become the next President of the United States, and a lot sooner than he had anticipated. But there are some, serious issues. And likewise, I think we have, issues with the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo knew very well that his ambassadors, especially Ivanokovich, was being smeared by Rudy Giuliani, and he said nothing about this. He didn't come to their defense. If he had an ounce of integrity, if he had an ounce of real leadership quality, he would have come to the defense of members of his own department when they were nothing more, nothing less than doing their constitutional duty, and yet he remained quiet. It has been suggested, and I have no way of knowing whether this is true, that Pompeo wants to run for president in either 2020, if Trump is no longer the president, or in 2024. Perhaps that's true. I mean, it's hard to evaluate his motives, but I certainly can, I think, criticize the degree to which the Secretary of State has not done his duty. It's a lapse in judgment. It's a lapse in moral character, and I think that it's just shocking. I might add, by the way, that Secretary of State Pompeo graduated first in his class at West Point. Well, maybe he was very, very good in classes in engineering and classes in military strategy, but he failed, and this is a point that one of his critics has already made. He apparently failed, flunked all of his courses on ethics and on leadership. And I think that, that's another thing that we're going to have to worry about. I also want to, if I may, eventually turn when we deal with, this day in history. I want to talk about the Gettysburg Address.
Sure.
And I want to kind of tie, in some ways, what was going on during Lincoln's administration to what's happening right now.
Dr. Ostrower, Watergate, I was about 4 or 5 years old at the time, so I don't really remember the hearings, like I would Iran-Contra or something like that. During Watergate, were the hearings televised nonstop during the day, or was it summarized at night on the nightly TV news?
No, they were televised. The Army McCarthy hearings back in the 1950s were televised. I remember as a little kid, I would go home and I would find them on TV. I'd want to put on cartoons at that time, and I had to listen to the Army McCarthy hearings. The Watergate likewise was televised. And one of the key moments in the Watergate hearings was a moment when a fellow named Alexander Butterfield, a naval officer, but who was working in the White House at that time, revealed that President Nixon had been taping all conversations in the Oval Office. And so, until that point, no one had been able to specifically tie Nixon to giving an order to, cover up what had happened during the Watergate break-in. And this was a real turning point. And I might add, by the way, that until then, the Republicans in the House and in the Senate, this is back during the Watergate period, so this would have been 1972 and into 1973, had stood by the president, okay? Just as the Republicans today are standing by Donald Trump, so the Republicans stood by President Nixon. And the first real crack in that Republican support for Nixon was when Butterfield said, hey, wait a minute, we really have the tapes here. And, of course, the tapes reveal that the president had indeed participated in a cover-up. As a matter of fact, one might argue that the cover-up during the Nixon administration was even worse than the initial crime. But in either case, I think that Republican support eroded, and then after some additional tapes were revealed, tapes of those conversations in the Oval Office that absolutely tied the president to illegal activity. And eventually, even the leading Republican senators, conservative senators, in 1974, approached President Nixon and said, look, we can no longer support you. You're going to be, not only have you been impeached, but you will be convicted when it goes to the Senate, the trial in the Senate, and therefore we suggest that you resign. And President Nixon did exactly that in August of 1974.
Dr. Ostrower, as you were talking about the Nixon tapes there, I got thinking that recently Congressman Tom Reed up on his Facebook page posted part of the transcript from the Nixon tapes, and I want to read a little bit of it. It says, Nixon, the way I want that handled, Bob, is through another way. I want Brooking just to break in. Break in, you understand. Haldeman says, but who do we have to do it? Nixon says, well, don't discuss it here. You break into the place, rifle into the files, and bring it to me. Now, Reed's point is that there's smoking guns with Nixon and not with Trump, but kind of interesting that they bring this up. Congressman Tom Reed's views on this are interesting. He believes that there was something to Watergate, that there's nothing to this particular situation with President Trump's impeachment, but he also believes that they were way too hard on Bill Clinton. Would you agree, Dr. Gary Ostrower, that with Congressman Tom Reed, they're on the point that they were too hard on Bill Clinton?
Well, I think that with Clinton, it was a crime of sex, cover-up of that. He did commit perjury. But the real issue here, I think, is that, initially with Ukraine, the president has said we did nothing wrong. There was nothing in that transcript that suggests that I committed a crime. Now many Republicans are saying, well, he did do something wrong, but it doesn't rise to the level of an impeachable offense. In other words, the Republican defense of the president has been changing around, and I think that Congressman Reed, is really very, very incorrect, really wrong if he said is that there's nothing there. I think there's a great deal that's there, and I'm waiting for a congressman, some member of either the House, a Republican member of the House of Representatives, or perhaps a member of the Republican Senate, who is going to stand up and say what Howard Baker, but Senator Howard Baker said back during the Nixon years. Baker said finally, hey, look, we can't ignore the fact that there is an impeachable crime here. When did the president know this was going on, and at what point did he know this, and so forth? What did he say? What Baker did was to really, in some ways, jeopardize his own political career by calling the president out. No Republican has been willing to do that in the present circumstances, and yet I'm guessing, and I find it distressing that no one has done this up to this point, but I'm guessing that sooner or later one of them is going to have the courage, one of them will have the background to stand up and say what the president did is absolutely unacceptable, it is an impeachable offense, and it represents the degree to which this man is unfit to be president of the United States of America.
Do you see the Senate convicting or no?
Absolutely not. At least at this point, I think I'm not even positive that the Senate will allow for a trial. I mean, that is a decision that the Senate can make. I am sure that the House of Representatives is going to vote at least one and possibly more than one articles of impeachment. But whether the Senate will consider them is very, very hard to say. And at this point, maybe one or two or three Republican senators will come over and vote to convict. But the fact of the matter is that you need 2/3 of the Senate. And that means since the Republicans have a majority in the Senate right now, I think it's extremely unlikely that the Senate is going to convict. Or to put it differently, the Senate is putting their political interests above the national interests. They are placing their party before they are placing their country. And I find that to be a very, very sad thing. I want to say one last thing about your comment about Jessica Williams. Jessica Williams is that State Department official who is now working for Congress, for the vice president. What she is going to say is going to, I believe, link the president not only to imply that he knew what was going on, but that he in fact knew exactly what was going on. And there's another fellow by the name of Holmes, who was a State Department official who was in Ukraine at a time when the president had called, I believe it was Sondland, the fellow who was the ambassador to the EU, again, a Trump administration appointee, who I think is going to be testifying later this week. And what this fellow Holmes is going to do is to testify that the president not only knew about this issue of corruption and was trying to get the Ukraine president to investigate the Bidens, but that this fellow Holmes heard on a telephone call Trump saying exactly that, a telephone call when they were in a restaurant and others could hear the conversation between Sondland, who was in that restaurant, and the president. So in other words, I think what you're going to find this week is that this whole issue is going to come closer to actual words of the president, to the fact that the president did know exactly what was going on than we heard up to this time. In other words, no more allegations of hearsay. We're going to hear about what the president had said in his own voice.
And we're going to take a break. Late on doing that, talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, This Day in History. When we get back,
the DJ you should hire listens to you about the kind of party or reception you'd like to have, pronounces your name right, plays the music you request, not the songs he feels like hearing. The DJ you should hire works out the songs ahead of time with you. Sean Stewart, DJ Truth, for all occasions, weddings, dances, graduations, anniversaries, and parties. 661-7658. 661-7658. 661-7658 for Sean Stewart, DJ Truth.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carroll, who's saying cloudy and cool today.
That's right, Brian. Not a whole lot of sunshine in the forecast. Anybody see sun in the state? It'll be out east of and south of Albany. Looks like here in the western half of the state, we're going to continue to deal with a lot of cloudiness. And that prevents us from warming up at all. We'll get to about 40 to 45 today. That's about it. Sunrise this morning was at 7:06. Sunset tonight at 4:45. Tonight, we'll see clouds. There may be an isolated flurry that comes through, but nothing that's going to cause any problems. Lows overnight 30 to 35. Clouds tomorrow. There could be an isolated sprinkle or a flurry during the day. It'll be 40 to 45. Cloudy 30 to 35 tomorrow night. And cloudy on Thursday with the chance of some late day showers. High temperatures on Thursday between 45 and 50.
Thank you, Rob Carroll. Back to Dr. Gary Ostrower. Dr. Ostrower, 77 years ago. That's how President Abraham Lincoln opened up the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And Lincoln then went on to say that we're engaged now in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. And that's where I think that there's a connection, if you will, between, yesterday and today. I'm not sure that our country will long endure in quite the way in which it was originally established. I've often said to my students at Alfred University that the Gettysburg Address is one of the three most important documents in all of American history. The first of those documents is the Declaration of Independence. The second one is the United States Constitution, and the third is the Gettysburg Address, which really, in a sense, refers back to that Constitution and to the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to understand that when Lincoln gave that address, it was all of about maybe 250 words or so. The address lasted for somewhere between 2 and 3 minutes. He never once did he use the pronoun I. It was occasionally we, for the most part, in other words, but he never talked about himself. And I think that our listeners should consider that, okay, and compare that to the kinds of addresses that they get, the kind of tweets that they get from the White House, where the president says, "I am the chosen one," where he calls himself a stable genius. There's a kind of loftiness, there's a kind of idealism in the Gettysburg Address that's so very, very missing from the White House today. The other point I want to make about the Gettysburg Address is that it followed the most important battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. It was a battle, I think, in which General Lee, the Confederate commander, Robert E. Lee, made a terrible, terrible judgmental error. What he tried to do was to kind of sweep north, go into Pennsylvania, and then have his army come down onto Washington, D.C., with the expectation that the Union would surrender, that they wouldn't continue the war. But in fact, the Union Army, which was led at that time by a fellow named George Meade, General Meade, kind of followed up, and the two armies eventually met at Gettysburg. It was a dreadful battle. It was a 4-day battle, about 45,000 casualties altogether. That includes men who were wounded, men who were missing in action, of course, those who were killed. And at the end of the battle, the Union had won. The Union won the day. The Confederates had to retreat. A few months later, that is to say, in November, the cemetery would be dedicated, and our notion of, if you will, of death of military death is going to change as a result of what happens, not just during the war, but at the consecration of that cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. In any case, the president gave that speech. He wasn't the main speaker. The main speaker was a guy by the name of Edward Everett, who spoke for over 2 hours. And then the president stood up and he gave his address. It was very, very short, as I say, just about 2 to 3 minutes or so. There were people who criticized the president for not having spoken longer, for calling his comments silly. But of course, they were anything but silly. But what they did more than anything else is to remind us that we live in a country under the rule of law, that no individual, not a president of the United States, not a speaker of the House of Representatives, not a chief justice of the Supreme Court, that no individual is above the law. And I think it's, from my perspective, it is that principle, the principle that no one is above the law, that's being tested today when the president of the United States is essentially saying that even though he broke the law, it doesn't rise to an impeachable offense, and then he tells, well, he really didn't break the law at all, and then he demeans and he dismisses his critics and so forth. I think that we are at a turning point of American history, and I hope that we are going to be true to our constitutional principles and to the principles that Lincoln articulated when he delivered that Gettysburg Address.
With that, we have to go, Dr. Ostrower. Get to the morning updates from Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and the local news. Thank you so much, as always, Dr. Ostrower, for joining us.
Thanks again for having me, Brian.